Thank you, Paul. I want to thank the program committee for the invitation to speak today, and I also want to begin by acknowledging my colleagues on this project, Dr. Joel Berger, Dr. Kim Murray, and Renee Seidler. I also want to thank our funding sources and cooperators, including the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Shell, Ultra, Questar, Grand Teton National Park, particularly Steve Kane and Sarah Dewey there, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Jackson office, and the Pinedale office, and in addition, the Pronghorn Working Group of Wyoming Game and Fish and the Bureau of Land Management. So today what I want to do is begin by talking about long-distance migration as an imperiled ecological phenomena. I'll put this in a little bit of a global context. I won't spend much time on that. And I'm going to focus more on a local context, focusing on one pronghorn migration in the Upper Green River Basin of western Wyoming, which is the southern part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I'll talk about some of the attributes and threats to this particular migration to make some points. Particularly looking at the threat that may be occurring from habitat fragmentation and loss due to natural gas field development on crucial winter range for pronghorn in the Upper Green. And I'll talk about our study approach, our results, and wrap up with some conclusions and lessons learned. So when we look at overland migrations across the globe, we have data for 29 species, multiple stays of those species, and they occur on most continents, but there's a plethora of data for obvious reasons from North American continent, so we have a little bit of a bias in the data set. But when we look at the types of species that make long-distance migrations, they vary widely, but we're losing a lot of the population segments and actual populations of the long-distance migrating components of these animals. So we see species as diverse as chiru, zebras, Asian gazelles, world-famous wildebeest migrations, but there's also species we may not think of initially when we think of long-distance migrators, such as hulans in the Gobi Desert, huemulls in South America, and various populations of elephants. Here in North America, we have world champion migrators in the form of caribou, particularly barren ground caribou, but also muskox populations, moose, bighorn sheep, and elk in places like the greater Yellowstone ecosystem make long-distance migrations. In fact, when we look at the data that for terrestrial migrations in the Western Hemisphere, so I've removed Arctic, Africa, and Asian species, what you can see is the mean distance is shown here in the bars. The furthest known migration from the literature is shown in the bubbles. For 5 species, the longest migratory population occurs in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So moose, bison, mule deer, elk, and then the pronghorn of the Upper Green River Basin, which I'll talk about here today. So let's ask the question, how important is connectivity? Well, the first thing we know is that for a species like pronghorn that doesn't deal with deep snow very well, being able to move across a permeable landscape between winter range and summer range is important. And when we look at known recent migrations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for pronghorn, what we've seen is over the last several decades, we've lost 75% of those. And remember, this is in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is considered one of the most intact and well-protected temperate ecosystems in the world. Yet we've lost 75% of the known long-distance migrations in this system. Most of these due to habitat alteration and loss, and some due to roads. We're down to essentially 2 long-distance migrations in this system. The one in the Mass and River Valley of Montana is tenuous because of subdivision development at the southern end as they move over into the Henry's Lake area of Idaho. So we're essentially down to 1 long-distance migration of pronghorn in the Yellowstone system. This being the animals that move from summer range in and around Grand Teton National Park to winter range in the Upper Green. This is the second longest migration known in the entire Western Hemisphere, second only to barren ground caribou. So it's a pretty spectacular ecological phenomena. At WCS, working with National Park Service partners and also Wyoming Game and Fish, and there's been some data collected early on this population by the Wyoming Co-op unit researchers. What we've seen is that the route is invariant. And this was, I've just shown 10 individuals. We've collared over 50 individuals at summer in Grand Teton just to make a couple points. This was demonstrated nicely by this female on her return trip in the spring to summer range. She tried to go over the Grovant Mountains in several places, ended up coming back around and joining the migration to her summer range. It's just really driven by geography. But the important point that I want to make is that of every animal we've ever collared either in the park or on winter range that ends up using the park, they all overwinter inside the boundaries of two of the largest natural gas fields in the U.S., the Pinedale Anticline Project area and the Jonah Field, which we've heard mentioned several times today. And so there's concern by the National Park Service and others that what is happening on winter range is directly influencing, because of this ecological phenomena, the long-term persistence of a species of megafauna inside the national park. So in 2008, the Bridger Teton National Forest actually made this the first federally designated migration corridor, known as the Path of the Pronghorn. And this particular system sets up well for this type of thing because 95% of the land that the animals are traversing is already in federal jurisdiction. The Forest Service basically designated the northern 70% of the migration corridor. The southern 30% occurs on BLM lands and a little bit on private lands, and I'll talk about that here more. What you can see here, this is just to help orient you in western Wyoming. So Grand Teton National Park, the Tetons, the Wyoming Range, Salt River Range, the Winds, town of Pinedale's in here, and the gas fields in the upper green. On the migration corridor, there's three principal bottlenecks or pinch points that if we lose that migration, we lose animals in the park. And so the designation really kind of took care of the Red Hills bottleneck. There's been a lot of effort by the Park Service and the Forest Service. The funnel, this is where we have the majority of the private lands. There's been a lot of land grant, or excuse me, a lot of land trusts working with private landowners in there to install wildlife-friendly fencing, put conservation easements. So that potential bottleneck is in fairly good shape. The most famous bottleneck is this Trappers Point one in the south. It's a natural bottleneck of the sagebrush system between two riparian areas, the Green River and the New Fork River. Historically, it's been about 1 kilometer wide. Because of subdivision development in this corridor, it's down to about 0.5 kilometer wide. The BLM has actually put some ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern, to keep natural gas development out of the actual bottleneck. And so it's becoming more protected, particularly with the last threat in this area, and that was that Highway 191 goes across this migration corridor right in this bottleneck. And so these animals are having to cross this 2 times a year. And based on the data that we collected in 2010, the Wyoming Department of Transportation made what I thought was a pretty significant decision. They spent $9.7 million on 8 crossing structures. They built 2 overpass structures and 6 underpass structures along a 13-mile stretch of the highway to protect not only this migration corridor, but also mule deer. And I'm actually heading back up there today because the animals are in the process of migrating this week, but just in the last week, we've documented successful use of the crossing structures by Pronghorn. So I bring all this up to make the point that with a long-distance migration, this ecological phenomena that we know is declining globally and also in places like western Wyoming and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem at large, you know, we have a lot of groups working to protect this migration, and so if we're really going to maintain this type of ecological process, we need to be concerned with all 3 aspects: summer range, the migratory path transition range, and then the winter range. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk, is what is happening on winter range that's under the management of BLM. In the upper green, we have abundant wildlife. At one time, it was estimated that there was over 100,000 overwintering ungulates, mule deer, elk, moose, and pronghorn in this region. So those are Serengeti-like concentrations. It's also a stronghold for sage grouse in western Wyoming. However, in the same region, we have abundant gas reserves. There's an estimated 30 to 50 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in 2 gas fields. Just to show you those, we've heard about them today, but to put them on the map, this is the Pinedale Anticline Project area, known as the Papa, and the southern one is the Jonah Field. It's smaller, but it's being more intensively developed than the Papa. Although there are some proposals, the normally pressured Lance area, that may expand the Jonah Fields area by about 2 times its size or more. So because of all these issues, we wanted to assess the potential effects of gas field development on pronghorn resource selection distribution during the winter. When we look over time, habitat change has been rapid. We're seeing significant fragmentation and habitat loss due to infrastructure, roads and well pads. Gas fields may affect wildlife in several ways. I'm going to go through this pretty fast because it's been mentioned several times today, but we can have direct habitat loss. We can also have indirect habitat loss due to behavioral avoidance, and so the impacts of fragmentation and disturbance could actually permeate out into what otherwise would be suitable habitat from a structural standpoint. Gas fields could also potentially lead to direct death from things like roadkills. This is just an example. In January 2007 in the Jonah field, we had 20 pronghorn that were killed in a single collision with a gas truck. You can also have potentially energetic costs of disturbance. So in places like the Upper Green where you have severe winters, these animals are overwintering at 7,000 feet. You have cold nights, so they're on a sliding scale body mass reserves throughout the winter. And so the more time they spend being vigilant or in fleeing behavior as opposed to ingesting forage, that sliding scale and loss and decline of body mass is sped up, and that could potentially be an impact. There's also the potential to introduce disease, lead to exposure to toxic substances, and increase stress levels, all of which could reduce survival or fecundity. Now, the extent of the effects are going to be determined by the proximity of the population to carrying capacity. So in this case, pronghorn are hunted in Wyoming, so thought is that if they're held below carrying capacity from some other source, then the true impacts of gas field development may be masked. Of course, the extent of effects will also be determined by the amount of habitat loss and the extent to which animals rely on the impacted areas. So just to give you a little bit more information about the Papa, this slide's a little outdated. It's a fairly decent sized area. The existing disturbance is a little higher at this point, but in the Supplemental EIS in 2007, they created these core development areas, which you can see in these colors, where the proposed disturbance of this would be up to 40% of the area. And so there's a potential for extensive habitat alteration over about the 15 to 25-year lifespan of the project. And I bring these DAs up because for a specific purpose, and that's because especially DA 2 and 3, which are right here, these have been included in crucial winter range designations by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for almost 50 years. And these are just some data that'll show 1 year's worth of data, and you can see pronghorn locations are relying heavily on this. And so the decisions that are made in this particular area of the gas fields, of course they leave the area during the summer and then back in the following fall, are directly going to impact not only the animals that migrate into Grand Teton National Park, but several subpopulations of pronghorn in the region. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, to date, every animal that summers in Grand Teton overwinters inside these gas fields. So what's our study approach to address some of these questions? Well, it was just a comparative study comparing animals in experimental areas inside gas fields to control sites. We're capturing pronghorn using net guns fired from helicopters. We're placing GPS collars on adult females that collect up to 8 locations per day. We're also taking blood and fecal samples and body mass measurements. This is just a breakdown of the 400 females we've GPS collared since 2005. You can see our experimental capture locations are controlled. They're just color-coded by year. And I wanted to make the point of high site fidelity. These are just some data from 2005 to show this, but it holds throughout all the years. Our experimental animals stay in the gas fields. Our control animals are rarely in the gas fields. So it's easy to classify animals whether they're experimental or control. So what are we doing? The first thing we're doing is looking at overall animal health. We're screening animals for exposure to 8 potential diseases. We're also looking at eco-toxicology levels, PCBs, organophosphates, for example. We're also looking at stress levels between the control and experimental animals through fecal glucocorticosteroids. We're looking at survival and conditioning. We're estimating annual survival rates, and I'll talk about the models we're using in Program Mark. Looking at differences in pregnancy rates using fecal and serum progesterone, and we're looking at differences in body mass. And so we're trying to do a comprehensive look at this, not only from a demographic perspective, but also behavior. And so we're looking at pronghorn resource selection and group distribution on winter range in response to habitat loss, fragmentation by well pads and roads, and controlling for snow depth, because we know for a species like pronghorn, snow depth has an overriding influence on their distribution. So what are some results? To date, we've seen no evidence of disease. All our ecotox screenings are below minimum detectable levels, so there's no evidence of exposure to harmful chemicals, either in control or experimental areas. When we look at stress levels, in this slide and all subsequent slides, experimental animals are going to be in dark, control animals in the lighter color. What you can see is we're seeing significant differences among years, but we're not seeing any significant differences between control and experimental animals in stress levels. I will point out that our stress levels were elevated compared to a couple other controls we ran from the Pocatello Zoo and the National Bison Range of Montana, not surprising given the extreme winter conditions that these animals are in. For our survival analysis, these are based on monthly telemetry flights. We're using program MARC. I'm not going to go into a lot of these details, but we're using known fate models. We're allowing models to vary by site, year, and body mass. The take home is to date, we're not seeing any demographic impacts. We're not seeing any differences in survival between control and experimental animals. We're also not seeing any differences in pregnancy rates. There are differences between years, but not between animals using gas fields and females not, and we're not seeing any differences in body mass. When we look at the behavior, what we wanted to do was model factors that would influence pronghorn resource selection distribution in the winter, and so we had all the typical variables you see in these types of models: elevation, slope, aspect. We had snow depth. We created our own snow models. We took snow depth measurements at 81 locations throughout the study area, and we used an inverse distance weighted technique to create our snow models for each month during each winter. And you can see all the details in a paper we just published this year. We also included these gas field factors such as distance to nearest road, distance to nearest well pad, and habitat loss or disturbance. This is just an example of our disturbance layer. We gridded off the study area in 300 meter by 300 meter grids. And those were based on just some median distances that pronghorn were responding in some prior analyses that we did through GPS locations to gas field infrastructure. And so we felt that was a good distance at which pronghorn were responding to infrastructure in the environment. So I'm not going to go in and show the big tables. Again, you can read all this if you are interested in the actual parameter values. But the take-home messages are two. One, the interaction between snow depth and gas field infrastructure and habitat fragmentation is really complex, and it's difficult to tease apart. However, having said that, what we see is when we look at the probability of use using these mixed effects resource selection function models. So probability of use is higher in the blue areas, lower in the kind of the lighter blue areas. What you can see is we're seeing a decline in the percentage of patches classified as highest probability of use over time, particularly in the Jonah and also in the spine of the Papa anticline over time. In fact, when we look at the percentage of patches classified as very high use, we've seen an 82% decline, a 5-fold decline from 2005 to 2009. In those highest probability of use areas. And so what this means is that we're seeing fine-scale habitat abandonment of crucial winter range by pronghorn in response to the highest density developed areas in the gas fields. But yet, we're not seeing demographic effects, and I'll get to that here in a second. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, because we have control and experimental animals and there's high site fidelity, the effects are not going to be uniform. In this particular year, this is just 1 year's worth of location data for different animals. Our control animals in green, they're not using the gas fields. The experimental animals locations in blue, they are using gas fields. The yellow ones are just the animals that summered in Grand Teton National Park. And so because there's this spatial segregation, the effects of the gas fields are not going to be uniform throughout the population. And it's not going to be uniform across individuals. You have to account for that individual variation, and that's why we ran mixed effects models as opposed to fixed effects models. By running that mixed effects models, it allows us to account for that individual variation, and the models fit the data much better when we did that. And this is just an example of the individual variation. This is locations relative to the gas wells, which you can see in red. She was showing apparent avoidance of the most densely developed region of the Jonah field in 2006. In the same winter, number 902, she didn't show apparent avoidance of the same area during the same winter. And so I think this is why you kind of hear sometimes that, well, pronghorn, or, you know, they'll habituate and they'll deal with some level of disturbance. And I guess I would say that some pronghorn will, not necessarily all pronghorn. So in conclusion, we know snow depth has an overriding influence on pronghorn distribution. It wasn't surprising. The higher the snow depth, the lower the probability of use in our models. But when we account for that, we see evidence of gas field avoidance, at least by some individuals, based on their locations and movements, and definitely based on our resource selection function models. We're seeing fine-scale abandonment of crucial winter range by pronghorn in the Papa and Jonah. However, to date, there's no evidence of a demographic effect. And so part of this is because the surface disturbance is at a level that I don't think we've probably decreased the carrying capacity yet enough that we're seeing that. And I think, you know, how pronghorn respond to things in their environment, they're highly mobile. And so we're seeing kind of a delay in the response. And there may not ever be a demographic response, but we think our behavioral responses are a precautionary tale to think about what may be coming in terms of demographic responses that may be similar to what mule deer are experiencing in the same area. So again, you know, I think one of the points I wanted to make today is that when we think of natural resource extraction, in this case natural gas exploration and development, we tend to think of the impacts only being inside the gas field boundaries. But when you deal with ecological phenomena that occur at large scales, like long distance migration, the impacts can really be system-wide. And in this case, what we're seeing is that the outcomes and the decisions that are being made on BLM lands and in these gas fields could directly impact the long-term persistence of pronghorn in Grand Teton National Park. And also, I would just again reiterate that, you know, the behavioral impacts in this particular study of pronghorn were seen before demographic impacts, and so studies that combine both behavior and demographic components of the study may have advantages because behavior may be a better or an earlier sentinel to what impacts may be coming. But, you know, this remains to be really teased apart. So finally, what are some of the lessons that we've learned from the path of the pronghorn animals? And again, that's just one of many migrations of pronghorn into the Upper Green River Basin, but it's just one for an example. We know that summer range is fairly secure because of the National Park Service, Grand Teton National Park, and the efforts of the U.S. Forest Service. The migration corridor is better than it was in terms of its security. We have 70% of the corridor being designated by the Forest Service, but the 30% in the south that occurs on BLM lands is still kind of a mixed bag. And winter range seems to be potentially vulnerable if we continue to develop past some of these thresholds of development where animals are abandoning crucial winter range. They can deal with that at some level up to some point, but, you know, obviously you can only withstand so much loss of crucial wintering areas in a place that has really deep snow in a lot of places during the year before you potentially see demographic impacts. So with that, I want to thank all the different people and groups that helped in this study, particularly Quicksilver Air for their help with capturing animals. I'll thank each of you for your time out of your busy schedules to come and hear the presentation. And if I have any time, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, so fire away.
Right, so the question is there any follow-up on basically monitoring and examining as there's changes in what's going on in some of the areas, the Pinedale Incline project area and the Jonah? And the answer is I don't know fully, because what we're doing, we're still working on this population, but we have moved to a very specific segment where we were working on winter range and capturing down there and focusing on that early on in the study. We, as an organization, have moved to focusing just on the path of the pronghorn herd. And so we have 30 callers out right now, but they're all from that segment, and West Inc. is now doing that monitoring, and so that question would have to be addressed by them. But I think there is follow-up monitoring under the PAPO board's direction in the area, so I think that monitoring is still occurring to look at those questions. What the specific study entails at this point, I'm not sure. That's an excellent question. So the question is, could there be other factors that are suppressing the response, such as harvest, that may be keeping the population below a carrying capacity or some threshold where it would mask those impacts. And I think one of the things that we did is address that a little bit in the paper that I referenced. And if you look at the study area, so we were looking at pronghorn over about a 4,000 square kilometer area. And in that, there's 6 hunting units by Wyoming Game and Fish. We looked at the data that they had, and over the last 10 years, there's been an average of 2,500 pronghorn taken out of there a year. So we think that the pronghorn are being, held below what would be carrying capacity. And so what our suggestion is that if we're still seeing behavioral impacts, despite that potential masking, the impacts may actually be greater if the animals were at true ecological carrying capacity. And so I think it's really important to understand that just because we haven't seen demographic impacts doesn't mean that they're not going to eventually surface if you hit some threshold of density of development or a threshold of habitat loss. The flip side is we may not see demographic impacts the way pronghorn respond, but it's it's hard to predict the future, and so I think it just reinforces that the need to monitor. And I also would say that there was obviously, and I tried to make this point, there's individual variation. And so, some animals do potentially habituate, or whatever word you want to use there, to impacts in terms of fragmentation and habitat loss to some degree where other individuals in the population don't. And so, trying to disentangle, individual variation in all of this is going to be part of the challenge as well. No, so what we did is this project was actually before the establishment of the POPO board and all the mitigation funds. So we worked directly with Shell and Ultra and Questar, and they funded this independent before even the final EIS. We began the data collection. Well, with the behavioral data collection began in 2002, 2003, and the collaring aspect began in 2005, and the mitigation funds to fund the monitoring, I think it came online in 2009. So this was prior to all of that.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.